Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everything in between. Welcome back to Old Man Rambles. Um, this little blurb behind me from Media Chomp shows up on my social media feed every few months, like they all do. They make their rounds. The one behind me is about it's a woman like conversation that she says she hates dating nerds because of the gatekeeping that goes on. You know, she showed up wearing a Star Wars T-shirt, and he's like, "Oh, you're just wearing that to impress me." And she's like, "No, 100 million people saw Star Wars when it came out. A good chunk of them were probably women." Um, and then the conversation below that's like, "Oh, you should be more, forgiving of nerds because they've been teased and made fun of and bullied. They're gonna reject. They're gonna, not gonna trust any, you know, interest in their interest kind of thing." It's like, and a back and forth, and there's some discussion maybe to be had around that, but my brain went down a different rabbit hole when this conversation popped up in the most recent times, and that I'm a huge nerd. I have been a huge nerd my entire life. And growing up, admittedly, in a small town, and even once going to high school, you know, still not a very well populated area of the country, I never really saw any other female nerds. I mean, in high school, there was one girl who played D&D with us. Her name was Kathy. Um, every guy in the group tried to date her, which I'm sure was obnoxious for her, but she was also the only girl available. There's a part of my brain that feels sorry for her. I was attracted to her as well. Again, she's a female nerd, but she was the only one I ever saw who expressed really any interest, or at least in my age group. But amongst my high school of around 300 or 400 people, she was the only nerd I knew. But there's this discussion that female nerds have always been there, and it's true. When Star Trek was going to be canceled, it was women who organized the writing campaign to have Star Trek come out for another season. It was women who organized the first Star Trek conventions. There are dozens of female science fiction and fantasy writers. I have a bunch of them in my collection from that era. Anne McCaffrey, Catherine Kurtz, Ursula K. Le Guin, C.J. Cherub, Barbara Hamley. There's probably a couple of Melanie Ron. I could probably find a couple more from that time period. So, stories written by women tended to be more character focused, more story driven than the action packed sequences of the male writers. So there was content there for women to read. And I hung out, at the comic book rack constantly. There were 2 stores in my town that sold comic books, and I was, whenever possible, I knew what days they came in, what days the deliveries happened. Of course I did. But I was there on delivery day to look at the new comic books. And even sometimes, even not, I would just come back and paw through the racks looking for something to buy, something to read. We had a small bookstore, and I was a regular fixture in there because they did have a small, but for the size of the store, it was a good percentage of their shelf space was devoted to sci-fi and fantasy. Obviously, there was enough interest in it that the store devoted a good chunk of their, it was a space bigger than this wall, about the size of this wall, and for a small town, that's a good chunk of shelf space for a store. So it's obvious enough, and I never saw anyone in there. I once saw a woman in there, so I'm trying to buy something for her son. And I'm not saying nerdy women with nerdy interests didn't exist, and I'm not saying that they wouldn't ever have paid attention to me. This isn't like, a self-justifying rant or anything like that. I'm genuinely curious where they were. I would have, jumped at the opportunity to talk with anyone about my nerdy interest, regardless of gender. There were a few people that I knew that liked nerdy stuff that I didn't like, so I didn't, talk with them. But I mean, by and large, I was a pretty open and active nerd. I was not one of those guys who would go on endlessly to anyone about my nerdy interests. I had learned enough self-control to read my audience first. I didn't immediately start talking about Star Wars, Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Indiana Jones, comic books, nerdy novels, Dungeons and Dragons, video games, that kind of stuff. I didn't just leap right into that. I tested the waters first. But, I could go on at length about the things I was interested in if I found out someone was interested. If someone gave me the slightest opportunity, I would start going into this. Again, I could read my audience well enough that if they started to get that glazed look in their eyes, I would drop the subject. But yeah, I would have happily embraced anyone who shared my interests, provided I got along with them. Because again, there were people I did not get along with in the nerd community, or who had nerdy interests like I did. It wasn't really a community. And I'm honestly just curious where they were. Did they hide the fact that they were nerds because they thought they would be shamed for it, or because they thought, like the one girl in our group, that they would be pounced on as an available female interest? That probably would have happened. Was I so much of a self-absorbed introvert that I didn't notice them, which I guess was kind of possible. I'm just not sure. This is an honest curiosity. I know they were out there. Or was it that they just weren't that many because of the type of community that I grew up in? I mean, I grew up in a redneck fishing community, in the New England coast. Not a lot of opportunities for nerds in that area. They would not have been, well looked upon. But again, my bookstore, there was obvious enough of us to give, for the local businesses to make money off our nerdy interests. The local department store, Rennie's, had a toy section, and they had Star Wars toys, and Battlestar Galactica toys, and comic book, superhero action figures. They sold nerdy toys. There was obvious enough of us there that were interested in it. But there were never any girls to be seen that I saw. So again, where were they? That's pretty much in a nutshell. I didn't see any in them. Growing up, because there were so few, I didn't know about the girls saving Star Trek, the women saving Star Trek thing at the time. But I just kind of assumed that girls didn't like nerdy stuff. I assumed girls didn't like science fiction and fantasy and comic books, because I never saw any of them having interest in it. It was always just the guys. And a lot of the guys that I knew growing up kind of aged out of it. They decided that those things were just for kids, and we're going to be adults now and not do that anymore. Where were you? Good hunting.